In the depths of the earth, where sunlight is but a distant memory, and caverns stretch as vast as oceans above, a different world takes shape. The whispered stories from the surface speak of a silent realm where darkness reigns. But for those who ventured and lived in the underground world, it is anything but silent. Here, the thrum of life adapts, thrives, and pulses with an energy uniquely its own. How do denizens of these abyssal depths traverse the maze of tunnels? How do they trade in the flickering glow of bioluminescence? And how do they communicate across the echoing chasms? It's a world where every footstep is an exploration. Every whispered word can be echoed and become a lifeline. And every trade route can have its hazards. So strap on your lanterns and tighten your boots. Today, we're going to take a look at trade, travel, exploration, and communication in an underground world from the perspective of a fantasy world builder. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. Just before we get started on this video, this content has been available to members of my channel for some time now. If you want to help me make more content and get early access to my videos, you can pick up a wood membership to my channel for a mere €7 a month and help me make more content like this. And a shout out to Dylan Butters and Mr. Marmello, the latest members of my channel who make these videos possible. Okay, enough of that. Let's talk about underground navigation. The winding, enigmatic pathways of the underworld. These aren't your typical forest trails or cobblestone streets of a city. Here, every turn could lead to a glorious chamber filled with simmering crystals, or a treacherous pit waiting to swallow the unwary. So, how do our subterranean denizens navigate this maze? Before anything, let's just talk about the nature of the underground realm. It's not just a bunch of tunnels. It's a massive, three-dimensional, interconnected network of chambers, fissures, and routes. But unlike the world above, there's no horizon to guide you, no sun and stars to navigate with. You might be able to get direction from a compass, but that doesn't help much when you can only move where tunnels exist. So, what kind of markers would be important in this world instead of sun and stars and so on? Stalactites and stalagmites might seem like mere decorations to an outsider, but to the underground traveler, these formations are as vital as signposts on a highway. Over centuries, water dripping from the ceiling deposits minerals that grow both downward and upward, creating these majestic natural markers. Your route description in an underground world could include what stalactite and stalagmites mark the crossways, or indicate how close you are to a tunnel's end. Also, for exploration, it's handy to know that based on the size and the formation of a stalactite or a stalagmite, you can estimate the age and stability of a cavern. And speaking of things that are crafted by nature, there are pathways made by one of the most powerful forces in nature, water. Underground rivers, which might seem perilous, carve out the smoothest passages. Perhaps these passages are now dry, or perhaps your people navigate the river on underground skiffs. Also, the flow of water can indicate direction toward a cavern's exit or into its deepest heart. So an underground river or stream and the direction of its flow could be a very important route marker to your underground navigators. And speaking of route markers, bear in mind that your language for maps and routes will change. When your reference points are not mountains or rivers, but tunnels and chambers, The language of direction takes on a very different framework. Instead of saying at the forest grove, you turn to the north, you would say something like, take the third tunnel on the left after the chamber with the echoing falls. Or perhaps there's a tunnel that blows fresh air on your right. Don't take that one, take the next broad passage left. Depth, sound, airflow, tunnel consistency, and landmarks like the stalactites and stalagmites or gem deposits and so on become essential as indicators for routes. This, of course, is leading us towards underground maps. This kind of map would not just be length and breadth, it would have to include depth in some way. Your underground maps would have to be layered, marking out key chambers, airflow patterns, danger zones. And not everything is about what you can see, it's also about what you can hear or feel. Vibrations from certain tunnels might indicate areas prone to cave-ins or flooding from underground rivers. Noting such non-visual landmarks would be crucial on an underground map. And speaking of dangers, there are plenty of hazards to underground routes, from cave creatures camouflaged against the rocks to the silent threat of unstable ceilings ready to collapse, or the sudden and unexpected rush of water flooding a pathway. The underground is not for the faint at heart. And let's not forget about gas pockets. Areas with limited airflow can trap poisonous gases, making them deadly to traverse. We'll speak of these dangers in more detail when we get to the exploration section of this video, so stick around for that. Now, of course, you don't have to limit yourself to natural landmarks and maps to describe routes. Your people could create wayfinding systems. You could use phosphorescent markers which could glow eerily, indicating a safe path. Or certain marks could be carved into the rock walls, visible only to fingers touching them, and they could indicate what lies down a given tunnel. Miners have historically used specific symbols to indicate various conditions or directions within mines, and drawing on that example, we could create potential symbols you could use. For example, 2 crossed picks could indicate an excavation in progress. This would warn travelers that the structural integrity of a passage is not yet stable. A triangle with a point upward could be a symbol indicating upwards airflow. That would help travelers know where fresh air is coming from, especially if they need to find a place to breathe during a collapse or during a gas leak. A triangle with a point downward could conversely indicate downward airflow, or potentially an area where bad air or toxic gases pool. Or you could have wavy lines that represent water, and this could indicate either an underground water source or an area prone to flooding. You could also have something like a circle with a dot that could denote a safe refuge area or a space where fresh air supplies, where travelers could gather in emergencies. You must also consider where it is safe to use fire, and you could have a lamp or a flame symbol to indicate either where it is safe to use fire or where it's not safe to use fire. And then, of course, you could also have signs of ownership, something like a chain symbol indicating that a tunnel is private and may only be used by authorized users. You can adapt, combine, and alter these kinds of symbols as you need for your world-building purposes to give your underground world its own rich language of wayfinding. When designing paths and routes and people's way of traversing them, remember, it's not just about sight. In the underground world, you need to embrace the full spectrum of senses, understanding nature's markers, and respecting the dangers of the subterranean realm. And if you find the idea of navigating this underworld as intriguing as I do, give this video a thumbs up And let's talk about modes of transportation. Given the unique environment, inhabitants would have come up with innovative and adaptive ways to traverse the vast subterranean expanse. One traditional option would, of course, be the utilization of animals or creatures. We have examples from the real world, like the use of canaries in coal mines, not as a means of transport, but as an early warning system for toxic gases. So you could certainly use such animals in trading caravans and the like to ensure that travelers have some warning before disaster strikes. But in our imagined underground world, creatures like giant blind mole rats or sturdy underground dwelling reptiles could serve as mounts. Tolkien used wargs here. The goblins in Middle Earth rode wargs through the caverns of the Misty Mountains. Of course, you could also go with vehicles pulled by animals, and this could get interesting if you use giant moles or creatures such as Avatar The Last Airbender's badger moles. You could have animals that literally make their own tunnels while pulling a craft behind them. Tunnels are also quite suited for tracks, and their potentially smooth surfaces that aren't as much impacted by the weather could make vehicles like sleds more viable. Definitely something to consider when creating your underground vehicles. And speaking of vehicles, underground rivers would be the subterranean equivalent of highways. They would be crucial for trade, transportation, and even communication. But navigating these waterways isn't just about hopping on a boat and sailing away. These rivers could be pretty unpredictable, with swift currents and sudden waterfalls and submerged rock formations that could pose severe challenges. Or the tunnel through which they flow could suddenly become narrow, and crafts could get smashed up and their occupants drown without anywhere to draw breath. River crafts adapted for the environment might look a lot like kayaks or canoes, streamlined for maneuverability and with as little as possible above the waterline. Using ropes and anchors would be common, especially to allow for quick stops in case of dangers or to navigate treacherous waters. A great fictional reference here is Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth, where our heroes find the underground river they call Hansbach and follow its course, and they end up at an underground sea, which becomes a pretty significant obstacle for them to navigate. Now remember, in an underground world, you're not just talking about forward and backward and sideways travel. Going up and down is a pretty significant concern in this kind of environment. Elevators or lifts powered by complex pulley systems would be a common sight, especially in areas where vertical traversal is frequent. Some might even be operated manually, with teams of workers or animals dedicating to moving these platforms. Or they could use magic, or they could use mechanical engineering. One can think of the mines of Moria from Tolkien's world, where vast chasms and bridges exist, suggesting that the dwarves had intricate mechanisms for vertical movement. I think that these kinds of systems would often operate on a toll system, especially if you have lifts or pulleys that must be manipulated by animal or manpower. I could very easily see great trade routes with toll lifts where the owner of said lift grows fabulously wealthy. Such places would also be good places to have underground inns and rest stops and towns, either just before or just after the lift. And one last thing to consider in modes of transportation, we've been talking about underground travel exclusively, but it could be that some modes of travel is still outside of the underworld. Bear in mind, though, if these denizens were to venture out to the surface, it could be an overwhelming experience. The open skies could be terrifying for someone who's spent a lifetime beneath the ground. The lack of walls and familiar landmarks might induce agoraphobia. Their eyes, adapted to low light, might find sunlight blinding. A great example of this can be found in H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, where the Morlocks, used to living underground, are blinded and disorientated by the light when they come to the surface, and hence they only surface at night. Or in David Eddings' book, Ralph the Ulgo experiences extreme agoraphobia and light sensitivity when he has to travel outside of the Ulgo caverns. When considering transport in an underground realm, remember that it's not just about moving from point A to point B. You have to think about natural fissures, chasms, height differences, and how people traverse those difficulties. And if you found this section enlightening, let me know in the comments, and buckle up for our next journey, where we talk about underground trade. Underneath the sprawling surface, where daylight becomes a mere legend, what currency do you trade in? What rare commodities paint the bazaars in hues of wealth and wonder? Precious stones, gems, and minerals would probably form the heart of the subterranean realm, and they would obviously be an immediate allure to any world builder. You can imagine stalls lined with bioluminescent gems, radiating soft hues. Or perhaps your local drapery sells luminous silk woven from the threads of unique underground spiders, prized not just for its beauty, but for its faint glow, making its wearer an ethereal spectre in the dim corridor. Such items could also be hotly sought after by surface dwellers of your world who want to fill their coffers with gems and silks and rare earths. And what would they bring in trade? For the underground dwellers, surface world trinkets and products could be a rarity, bearing an exotic charm. Fresh fruits, sun-dried spices, furs and wools from overland animals, these goods could fetch a high price in the deep markets. An apple could be worth its weight in gold, not for its taste, but for the slice of sun it brings to the dark realm. So think about how much trade there is with the world above and how that trade happens. Are there specific locations above ground where underground goods are more valuable? Or perhaps the markets are underground and surface world goods fetch the highest prices. And of course, build up your own underworld stock of trade goods, thinking about things like clothing, gems, materials, and things that can only be crafted underground. And speaking of locations for markets, I think that trade hubs, much like our ancient Silk Road's caravanserais, would dot the vast underground networks. And if you want to check out my thoughts on the Silk Road, I did make a video on that in the information card. But back to these trade hubs. These trade hubs could be expansive caverns, perhaps illuminated by some magical source and echoing with the chatter of traders. Perhaps such hubs would have spiral tunnels reaching for the surface, allowing a mingling of both realms. And if you're wondering how to add light to the underground world, check out my video on life below the surface for underground civilizations, the first in this series. Okay, so that's trade goods and trade hubs, but is there something else to consider in trade? I'm glad you asked. Storage would benefit from the consistent temperature and humidity of the underworld. Underground cellars could house vintages of fermented brews, some of them aging for centuries, while the stable climate could allow for the preservation of dried goods over longer periods as well. So you could drive two pieces of economic activity from this. One, you could have the underground denizens just store things for longer and hence sell them for a higher cost. Or you could have them sell storage space as a trade service. Your overland dwellers could rent cellars for the purpose of long-term storage of drinks or even food, which would certainly make for a very interesting element of economic activity underground. And if this journey into the depths has ignited your curiosity, consider hitting that super thanks button and let's explore the topic of communication underground. Before delving into methods of communication that inhabitants of the subterranean realm might use, let's talk about the challenges they face. Underground, you have unpredictable acoustics, weird echoing surfaces, and vast distances that messages must traverse. A spoken word could bounce around a cavern for days and end up miles from where it was first uttered. Like the undersea world, the underground world has some unique challenges in the arena of communication. And if you're needing some help with undersea communication, I did make a video on that too. Hey, I've made a lot of videos, check them out. Anyway, onward with solutions for the underground communication challenges. First, let's talk about echoes. Echoes can be a real problem for an underground civilization, but it can also be a solution. In the vast caverns where whispers bounce and multiply, inhabitants could dance with the echoes rather than silence them. Choirs and musical ensembles could weave melodies that spiral through the caverns, creating an incredible resonance. And I will talk more about this when I get around to arts and culture stuff, but suffice to say for this video that such echo-harmonized choirs could be audio-based signposts indicating a path to follow to reach a city that maintains such a choir. But it doesn't all have to be ethereal song. You could use coded drum beats that echo off known surfaces and plains to travel through underground caverns and reach cities perhaps days of travel away. These echo pathways would of course have to be mapped out or perhaps even created, but it could be used by the denizens of the underground much the same way as we used the telegram once we had developed that technology. You could even use Morse code as the basis for an alphabet using echo drums or whatever you end up calling such a system. There is an alternative to drumming, which of course is traditional underground, drumming I mean. The alternative is a whistled language. Traditionally spoken words might distort underground, but a whistle language, reminiscent of the Silbo-Gumera language of the Canary Island, can cut through those distortions. Silbo-Gumero is a whistled register of Spanish used by the inhabitants of La Gomera in the Canary Islands. Historically, it was used to communicate across the deep ravines and narrow valleys that radiate through the island. Hence why I think it can be adapted for communication in caverns. Using Silbo-Gumero, messages can be exchanged over distances of up to 5 kilometers, and it was generally used for public communication. Now, I can't whistle for beans. I mean, see? But listen to this sample of the Silbo-Gumero language. Isn't that just awesome? And for whistling impaired people like me, you could have special flutes that allow this kind of communication. You could even give them like a special name unique to your world. Of course, communication isn't just about the spoken word, but also about written signs, as we discussed way up in the top in carvings and wayfinding systems. So remember those markings and travel signs too for your underground communication. And if you enjoyed this section, hit the thumbs up button and let's talk about exploration and tunnels. Venturing into the heart of the earth isn't like taking a leisurely stroll in a meadow. Taking inspiration from Verne's journey to the center of the earth, you can craft a myriad of perils for your intrepid explorers. You could have geological unpredictability from the shifting tectonic plates to sudden volcanic eruptions. The earth moving can be an ever-looming threat to your people. A city built beside an underground lava flow might enjoy its warmth, but what happens when the flow becomes erratic? Of course, where tunnels exist, a labyrinth is one wrong turn away. The feeling of being lost in an endless winding cavern where each turn looks hauntingly familiar can instill a dread deeper than any monster. As someone who has run a fair few of those in an RPG game, I do love me a good labyrinth, especially one that has a nasty or two hidden in the shadows. On a side note, I love that about the virtual tabletops, the aspect of controlling what players can see in such a labyrinth, where they can only see the screen as far as their light stretches. It makes labyrinths so much more scary. Anyway, back on point. It's not all tunnels and earth problems. Remember when we spoke of the importance of air in the first video? Well, imagine pockets of air with higher or lower oxygen level, areas saturated with noxious gases, or even places where the very air is luminescent due to microbial life. Breathing might not always be easy, and the very act of breathing could lead to hallucinations or altered states of consciousness. And it's not just funky air that can fool your eyes. Drawing from Verne's description of the mirage in the subterranean sea, you could craft areas where stalactites and stalagmites reflect and refract light in ways that create illusions, leading travelers astray or luring them into traps. One of those traps could even be a labyrinth. And if it's a known danger that a labyrinth is there, don't forget to add a wayfinding sign. There is one more real and present danger, and that's the weight of solitude. The psychological impact of being alone in a vast, echoing, and often lightless expanse as an explorer cannot be overstated. The overwhelming silence, the crushing weight of the earth above, and the haunting loneliness can be as challenging as any beast or environmental hazard. And all of this is, of course, assuming that the tunnels exist to be explored. But what if you don't have tunnels? What if you need to make tunnels? Well, you have a few options. If men with shovels is your only option, your tunnel growth won't be very fast, and you probably only dig short tunnels to connect existing chambers or fissures or caverns. You could, however, dig your tunnels with magic, having earth mages capable of creating smooth roads stretching between cities. If you do use magic for this, remember to add some costs and limitations and so on. In Magic Fall, I needed to make a tunnel, and the technique that I used was I had the mage create a cloth that was compressed into a single rope, and this rope burrowed through the earth. Then the cloth expanded, creating a tunnel with woven sides that someone can travel along, which I thought was a pretty interesting tunnel creation method, where you've got like a cloth that then expands. You can check out Magic Fall at Amazon.com for the EPUB, or if you want the physical book, head over to starvingwriterstudio.com. Links to both of those in the card. I will eventually do a video that talks about magic in an underground world and what I think is best used for the adaptation, but this video is already pretty long in the tooth, so it's not going to be here. Your third option for tunnel creation is, of course, fauna and flora, like the badger moles from Avatar: The Last Airbender as an example. Or you could create plants that tunnel through the earth and form the walls of the tunnel. If these plants are chemosynthetic plants, as I discussed in the first video, then they could even solve your air problem in tunnels by, taking chemicals out of the walls of the tunnel and turning that into oxygen for your travelers to breathe. But once you've created your tunnels, Bear in mind that they also have to be maintained. In fact, maintenance of underground infrastructure would be quite a large element of any given civilization. The underground isn't static. The ever-present danger of shifting rocks, sudden cave-ins, and relentless erosion means that the fight to preserve and maintain is eternal. So don't just create a means to make the initial tunnel. Also think about how those tunnels are maintained. Do the plants have to be renewed if you use a plant system? Are there machines that hurtle through existing tunnels, kind of compacting the sides and reinforcing the roof? How are rock falls reported if a traveler encounters them? Are there places where they can say, this tunnel is now fallen in and can't be used, or this tunnel needs to be cleared? All of these details can help you create a rich underworld civilization that feels real to your readers with its elements of travel, trade, bureaucracy, exploration, and maintenance. And those are my thoughts on trade, travel, and communication in underground worlds. Let me know in the comments what other aspects of underground civilizations you'd like me to cover. And as you leave the building, do check out my merch store with cool shirts like this one in it. And if you enjoyed this video, you might also enjoy my video on flying civilizations. And I will see you soon for another episode.